Welcome back to Port Elizabeth, the beautiful city. This is part 25, and we're down at Summerstrand on the beachfront. This was recorded in October 2014. These photographs were taken in October 2014. So I parked in 11th Avenue in Summerstrand and then walked towards that beacon that you can just see in the distance there. So that's a navigation beacon and quite a historic one. I couldn't establish how old it is. So there's a sort of decaying boardwalk through some of the plant dunes, really, next to the sea. But I think I just walked on the tar little track there. I think it's a bicycle track, actually. So we're heading towards this lollipop beacon. And so the beacon itself with the red and white stripes is quite historic. And then they added this public toilet built sort of adjacent to it, which kind of detracts, but anyway. Now there is another beacon inland of this, so obviously the aim was to line them up if you're out at sea on a ship, and that would give you a indication of where you were relative to any dangerous rocks or whatever. So I headed back. It was, again, a rather fraught situation here. You never really feel safe in South Africa. But very few people around, and that's part of the reason. So you're heading back towards Summerstrand, the sort of built-up part with hotels and tall blocks of flats. And of course, nice coastal dunes and a choppy sea out there. But on this occasion, I wasn't really out to look at the sea itself. I was going to focus on the landward side, really, of what was happening on the beachfront, on the landward side of Beach Road. So these are just taken as I walked away from the beacon. And Admiralty Way. Okay, so that's what I did. I actually tracked down the second beacon. That's it. So it's actually in the middle of the road, the one that they had to line up with. Then further on, we got this interesting little memorial or whatever. It's been vandalized, so the bronze plaque or whatever would have been there and just had been stolen. But it's an interesting little monument, this, to Joseph Starr Lister, born 1852 in Uitenhage, died 1927, Kenilworth, Cape Town. Now, why would this guy be famous? Lister. So it says here that in 1885, he married Georgina Bain, daughter of Thomas Charles John Bain, the road builder and engineer. So Bain is famous in South Africa for the passes that he built, particularly down in the Western Cape, around Cape Town. Lister went into forestry and by 1875 was superintendent of plantations in Cape Town. He established dunes at Belleville and then also used town refuse to do the same in this very area in Port Elizabeth in 1893. So this area, I've got pictures taken from the Donkin Reserve looking out towards Cape Recife, and there are drift sands throughout. I mean, it was totally uninhabitable. And Lister organized that the town refuse be dumped, and they actually planted, I think, alien vegetation, but it stabilized the dunes and it became a habitable place, you know. And then a very different monument. So this is a look at the Afrikaan. So the Trekboers had moved from the Western Cape, where the Dutch originally settled from 1652, over the next 200 odd years. In fact, 150 years, from 1652 till about the late 18th century, late 1790s, so forth. They migrated as what were called Trekboers. They migrated eastward. And by the time the British settlers arrived in 1820, there were farmers, Boer farmers, Afrikaner, Dutch farmers, all over the Eastern Cape, beyond what is currently Port Elizabeth. But unfortunately, this is where South African history becomes very tricky, because the Xhosa people, driven kind of westward by the Zulus, particularly after Shaka took over and became this warrior who forced a lot of tribes out in the 1820s. The clashes with the Xhosa and between the Xhosa and the Afrikaner farmers, the Trekboer farmers, that was one of the reasons why they brought in the 1820 settlers. They wanted to establish a buffer, really. They wanted to use these poor people as a sort of human barricade against further incursions by the Xhosa. I mean, these were actually meant to be farmers, but they had to do a military role. And it's been like that really ever since. I mean, that's been the story of South Africa, is this clash of cultures. And, you know, late Iron Age people, the Xhosa, and people coming from industrial revolution England. But I think you'll find that the Xhosa people learned a hell of a lot from the settlers and from the Boers, and vice versa. There was other learning the other way. And we just have to make the most of it. But anyway, this is a monument to one of the early Boer Afrikaner heroes in their reading of our history. And it's a very unappealing looking monument, let's face it. And it's to Peter Tiff, who actually owned a farm in this area and later moved to Grahamstown, where he got on well with the British settlers there. But ultimately they embarked on the Great Trek in the mid-1830s to escape British rule, essentially, and the emancipation of their slaves, among other grievances. But the upshot was that Peter Tiff, as we can see him there, ended up, so he was one of the leaders of this migration, and they ended up establishing republics, the Free State, Orange Free State, and then the Transvaal Republic. And that opened those areas, the interior of South Africa, to modernization and industrialization, and naturally mining became the big thing. Although it was mainly done by British immigrants, particularly the gold mines, and before that the diamond mines in the 1860s. So what does this say? This thing was erected in 1975, 100 years after the establishment of the Genootskap van Regte Afrikaners, to promote their language and nation. There's an image of the ox wagon, the famous trekker ox wagon. used by the voortrekkers as they headed north, and daar is Piet. So Piet Retief has been painted as a sort of, leading the colonization of African areas, etc. But there's two sides to every story, and this plaque reminds us that Retief was killed with 67 of his men in 1838 at Hlomo Amabutu, mustering of the soldiers in Natal, by the Zulu chief Dingaan while negotiating land ownership. So these people were actually invited to a feast and then were ruthlessly murdered, and actually their bodies were thrown on a rock for the vultures to eat. It was a horrific betrayal, really. So it says here in 1975, this monument was moved from the Kuche area to the site of the farm Strandfontein, originally owned by Piet Retief. So so it actually moved this from Kuche, where a new harbour has been built in the last 20 years or so. And that's just a plaque about the relocation, I think, or this surrounding work that was done here. And this plaque commemorates the 100th anniversary of Retief's death. Died in 1838. And then we've got students walking past, probably oblivious of the implications of this memorial. This sort of history is just not taught anymore. Or if it is, it's just portrayed as, colonial, the original sin of colonialism, and there's no nuance at all. Okay, so I stopped en route to Southend to look at this. In the middle, in the free-form profile is a free-form profile of a concrete observation post for the Algoa battery at Humewood, set up at the start of World War II as part of the city's defences. You can't really see it there because it's behind a kind of hill, but there were quite a few of these observation posts established along the Port Elizabeth coastline during the Second World War. Oh, there's a slightly better view, but I do visit one or two, actually two of them, and do a fairly substantial tour of them. So we'll see those later. In fact, here's an aerial view of the Algoa battery at Humewood. Let's see, so we actually zoom in later, but so there's that, that's Shark Rock Pier, the new pier, and inland of it is a military camp here. If you look down in this corner, there are two cannon emplacements. So this is an army barracks on the left. This is parking for the beach. This is a hotel, I think, City Lodge. But right here is the whole. This was the whole military emplacement. And if you look here, using Google Earth, 2 World War II guns still in place. So, any British tourist who's interested in in Second World War, and because the Royal Navy and the Air Force both had a presence in Port Elizabeth. And I don't doubt that the British military were also involved in setting up the defences here, or assisting in it. Anyway, from war to the peaceful promenade, Princess Promenade, built in 1923. And this is the kind of decoration that characterized it on all sides. So as we saw earlier, they redoing it and losing all this kind of beautiful 100-year-old decoration. Then there's a little museum here, which we'll get to. This red tank is part of the dolphinarium. I think water used to be pumped into there and then used into the big dolphin pool, which has ceased to be. A big pond that they built. And there's that tin hat that we spoke of earlier in a previous one. That's interesting. I discovered somewhere that the Promenade Dome, this one, has a twin in Bexhill-on-Sea, Sussex in the UK, called Delaware Pavilion. Hopefully I've got a picture of it, maybe not. So when I first arrived, this was a touch museum for children, and now I don't know what it is. Apparently it was originally a post office. So the date on there, 1939, so probably built just before the war completed. On the left here is Brooks Hill, which was a famous caravan park when I got to PE, but then has been built upon and is now just a couple of restaurants at the bottom, and then high-rise, upmarket blocks of apartment blocks, really, with beautiful views. I mean, and that you can imagine the views that you used to get from the caravan site. Yeah, so this is the view going up the stairs there. And these are the restaurants that I spoke about. And heading up what is called Brooks Hill Street, this is the Bay World complex where the museum is, and the dolphinarium was established in the 1960s. One of the first in the world, actually, to have captive dolphins. At one point, they didn't even know that dolphins were mammals. They just thought they were a species of fish. That's and the iconic aloe in amongst that. Okay, so in the previous video, one or two back, I spoke about the obelisk that should have stood in the Scottish cemetery at St. George's Park. Ultimately, it was placed in the Market Square, where it stood for 70 years or so. So this, George Kemp, it says here, bought by Patterson, John Patterson, the founder of the Herald, in 1862 at the London Exhibition, intended for the grave of George Kemp. That was actually his brother-in-law, erected in the Market Square. So from 1862, roughly, till 1921, what's that, 60 years, or give or take. So only the upper section was erected here in 1975. They probably lost that whole bottom section, which gave it all its elegance, So it's quite a nice object, and I'm glad at least they preserved this part of it. Of course, the plaque explaining its origins has been stolen as well. So this is the entrance to the museum complex, the Bay World complex, as it it's called, with all these old cannon. I'm not sure where they're from, and there's absolutely no boards, information boards around, unfortunately. So one's in the dark, it's just typical, really. Total lack of attention to detail and to any thought of what a tourist might want to know. Here we go with that obelisk again. So that thing stood there for 60 years until the end of shortly after the First World War. Then they put a cannon there, which is quite sad. So before I entered the museum, if I did on this occasion, I can't remember. I think I didn't. I'm going to do a video of I was photographed throughout the museum, its contents, so we can see a lot of the history of PE there. Yeah, that's Brooks Hill complexes there. And by this stage, they'd virtually completed the restoration of the Promenade. But look how bland it is. So it had that nice decoration we saw on the other side of the road. But now it's just grey concrete. I remember when they first started the first projects they did on Brooks Hill, I think with these and possibly those, this was the offices of the construction company or something to do with the whole development. And now it's a tea room, and I've actually never been there. So I need to do that sometime. Just walking up to the Tin Hat, and I think at that point we're going to have to stop here. So now nicely restored and looking spick and span. Unfortunately, a plaque that used to be here also no longer exists. I just liked playing here with the view from within. And we're heading on, and at this point I'm going to have to stop. So till next time, cheers.